I came home later than usual. The Chicago traffic had been relentless, the kind that made you question why you lived in a city at all. Work had drained me. Back-to-back meetings, endless emails, the constant demand to be available, to be productive, to be more. All I wanted was a quiet evening, a hot meal, and maybe, just maybe, a reminder that my home was still a place where I belonged. But as I stepped into the penthouse, I was met with nothing but silence. Cold, hollow silence. The air smelled faintly of something reheated. Leftovers, maybe, or worse, another overpriced takeout meal. It wasn't the smell of a home-cooked dinner, not the way it used to be. I shrugged off my coat, letting it slide onto the back of the chair, and took in the state of the living room. Shopping bags were scattered across the furniture, designer names practically screaming at me. Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Prada. Some of them were still upright, others carelessly tossed aside, their glossy surfaces catching the dim light of the city skyline behind them. The penthouse had become less of a home and more of a showroom for Lauren's latest indulgences. And there she was. Lauren sat on the couch, one leg tucked under the other, scrolling through her phone without even acknowledging me. The glow of the screen reflected in her indifferent eyes, casting sharp shadows on her face. She didn't look up. I watched her for a moment, my fingers tightening around the strap of my briefcase. "Hey!" I said, my voice rougher than I intended. She gave a small hum, more of an automatic response than anything, still focused on whatever was on her phone. Probably some influencer's latest post, a new trend to chase, another thing to buy. A flicker of irritation ran through me, but I swallowed it down. This was becoming our routine. Me coming home exhausted, her barely noticing. I dropped my briefcase by the chair and walked toward the kitchen. The counters were spotless, untouched. The oven hadn't been turned on, the sink was empty, and aside from a single takeout container sitting by the trash, there was no sign that she had done anything here at all. "Did you eat already?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. "Yeah." Her response was short, clipped. She still hadn't looked up. I opened the fridge, searching for anything edible. A few bottles of sparkling water, some overpriced organic yogurt, half a carton of oat milk. I sighed and grabbed one of the takeout containers stacked on the second shelf. The food inside was cold, untouched. She must have ordered it, picked at it, and then lost interest, just like everything else. As I heated up the food, I leaned against the counter and watched her from across the room. The way she sat, perfectly poised even in her own home, the way she scrolled through her phone with a look of mild disinterest. It was like she was in another world, one I didn't belong to. Years ago, things had been different. Lauren had been different. She used to greet me at the door, smiling, asking about my day. She used to cook, not because I expected it, but because she wanted to. She used to care. Now, she just existed in the same space as me, but we weren't living together. Not really. I took my food to the dining table, the scrape of the chair against the hardwood floor the only sound between us. I could feel the weight of the silence, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me. I wanted to break it, to say something, anything, but I didn't know where to start. "So, what did you do today?" I asked finally, picking at the food with my fork. Lauren sighed, a long, drawn-out breath, like the question itself was exhausting. "Just ran some errands. Went shopping with Claire." Claire, of course. Her best friend, the one who encouraged every expensive, meaningless purchase, the one who treated money like it was an infinite resource, just like Lauren did. "Looks like you had fun," I said, nodding toward the bags. Lauren finally looked up, but only for a second. "Yeah, I guess." I waited, expecting her to say more, to ask me about my day, to give me something. But she was already looking back at her phone. I chewed my food slowly, the taste bland, lifeless, just like this conversation. "Anything else?" I pressed. She shrugged. "Not really. Just the usual. The usual. Spending money, scrolling through social media, living in a world where nothing mattered except appearances." A wave of frustration built up in me, but I bit my tongue. There was no point in starting a fight. Not tonight, not when I was already exhausted. I finished eating in silence, setting my fork down with more force than necessary. Lauren didn't react. As I stood up to put my plate in the sink, I hesitated. Lauren. She finally glanced at me. Yeah. I searched her face, looking for something, anything. Some sign that she still cared, that she still saw me as more than just the person who paid for all of this. But all I saw was boredom, mild curiosity, like she was waiting for me to say something interesting. I shook my head. Nothing. She nodded absently and went back to her phone. I walked to the bedroom, stripping off my tie and tossing it onto the dresser. The bed was made perfectly untouched, as if no one had been in here all day. I sat down at the edge, rubbing a hand over my face. This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, and I was starting to wonder how much longer I was willing to pay the price. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, listening to the faint sounds of Lauren's scrolling fingers swiping up and down her phone screen in the other room. The sound used to be meaningless background noise, but now it grated on me. It was the only thing that ever filled the silence between us anymore. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly, trying to shake off the weight pressing on my chest. A year ago, I would have gone back out there. I would have sat down next to her, tried to hold her hand, maybe kissed her neck just to get her to smile. A year ago, I would have cared enough to fight. Now, I wasn't sure if I had the energy to try, or if I even wanted to. Because the truth was, I already knew how it would go. She would shift away, still staring at her phone, making some offhand comment about being tired or not in the mood, and I would be left there, feeling like an idiot for even trying. I had learned my lesson. I undid the top buttons of my shirt, loosening the tightness around my neck. The city lights cast a faint glow through the large windows, the view of downtown Chicago stretching endlessly in the distance. This penthouse, this place that was supposed to be ours, felt more like a cage with a really nice view. I leaned back against the mattress, my arms resting behind my head, willing myself to stop thinking, to stop caring. But my mind wouldn't let me rest. How had it gotten to this point? There was a time when Lauren was different. She had been full of life, full of excitement. She used to wake up early just to make me coffee, even though she never drank the stuff. She used to plan little surprises for me, weekend trips, small gifts, handwritten notes tucked into my work bag. And now she barely acknowledged me when I walked through the door. I knew people changed. I wasn't naive enough to believe that marriage would always be the way it was in the beginning. But this wasn't just change. This was something else. It was like she had slowly, piece by piece, removed me from her life until I was nothing more than an afterthought. The worst part? I wasn't even sure she realized she was doing it. I heard the soft patter of her feet as she finally moved from the couch. A few minutes later, the sound of running water came from the bathroom. She was getting ready for bed, going through her usual routine. I didn't move. I didn't want to. A few minutes later, she stepped into the bedroom, the glow of her phone still lighting up her face. She was in one of those silk robes, the ones she used to wear for me, but now she wore them just because they were expensive and comfortable. She sat on the edge of her vanity, scrolling, her bare legs crossed, completely immersed in whatever was on her screen. I waited, just to see if she'd say something. She didn't. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Lauren, she hummed in response, not looking up. I clenched my jaw. Can you put the phone down for a second? She exhaled sharply, like I had just asked her for something completely unreasonable, but she set it down beside her with an exaggerated motion. What? I hesitated. I didn't even know what I wanted to say anymore. I had spent so much time thinking about how disconnected we had become, but now that I had her attention, I felt stupid for even bringing it up. What was I expecting? That she'd suddenly snap out of whatever world she was living in and look at me the way she used to? Still, I forced the words out. Do you even want to be here anymore? She blinked, caught off guard. What kind of question is that? A real one. She frowned, shifting slightly in her seat. Of course I do. Really? I asked, voice flat. Because it doesn't feel like it. Her brows pulled together, and for the first time in a long time, She actually seemed to be processing what I was saying instead of just brushing it off. But just as quickly as that moment appeared, it was gone. She scoffed, shaking her head. "You're just tired. You always get like this when work stresses you out." I let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't about work, Lauren. This is about you. About us." She rolled her eyes. "Jack, come on. We're fine." "No, we're not," I said firmly, sitting up. "We're anything but fine." She sighed again, clearly irritated. "Okay, then what do you want me to say? That I don't love you anymore? That I want to leave? Because I don't, Jack. I'm here, aren't I?" "That's not the same thing," I muttered. She stood up, crossing her arms. "Then what is it that you want from me?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the same woman I married. Or maybe she was, and I had just been too blind to see who she really was all along. "I want my wife back," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "I want the woman who used to give a damn about me, about us." Lauren shook her head, letting out a dry laugh. "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" I challenged. "Because to me, it feels like I'm the only one still trying." Something flickered in her eyes, something close to guilt, but she buried it quickly. Instead, she turned away, grabbing her phone off the vanity. "I'm too tired for this," she muttered, walking toward the bed. I watched as she slid under the covers, back turned to me, acting as if the conversation never happened. And maybe, to her, it didn't. I exhaled slowly, standing up and walking toward the window. The city below stretched out in endless lights, people moving, living, loving, while I stood here, trapped in something that was slowly suffocating me. I used to believe that love was enough, that if you loved someone, you could work through anything. But now I wasn't sure if that was true, because I still loved her. But I was starting to think that didn't matter anymore. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling long after Lauren had fallen asleep. Her slow, steady breathing filled the silence, but it didn't comfort me. If anything, it only made the emptiness between us more unbearable. I turned onto my side, watching the dim glow of her phone screen as it lit up from a message. She had it on silent, a habit she never used to have. A year ago, she wouldn't have cared if I saw who was texting her. Now, she always kept the screen tilted away, always careful. I wasn't proud of the suspicion creeping into my mind, but it was there. It had been there for a while now, buried under exhaustion, under denial, under the naive hope that maybe this was just a phase. But phases didn't last this long. Phases didn't feel like this. I turned away, pressing my fingers against my eyes, trying to force my brain to shut off. Sleep never came. By the time the first light of morning crept through the windows, I was already out of bed. I moved quietly through the penthouse, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. I needed space, air. Anything that wasn't the suffocating weight of another silent morning with Lauren. The streets were quieter this early, the usual rush of the city still an hour or two away. I walked without a destination, just moving, letting my feet take me wherever they wanted. My thoughts raced, but no matter how many times I replayed last night's conversation, I kept landing in the same place. This marriage was slipping through my fingers. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I even had the strength to catch it. I stopped at a small coffee shop a few blocks from our building, one of those hole-in-the-wall places Lauren used to love, before she decided she was too good for anything that wasn't overpriced and exclusive. I ordered a black coffee, nodding absently as the barista handed it to me. The first sip burned, but I welcomed it. At least it was something I could feel. I sat at the farthest table, staring out the window, watching the city wake up. A woman passed by, holding the hand of a little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. He was chattering nonstop, his free hand waving around animatedly as he told some grand story. His mother laughed, nodding along, completely engaged in whatever he was saying. I used to imagine Lauren and I having mornings like that. I used to think about kids, about a future that wasn't just expensive shopping bags and silent dinners. But every time I'd brought it up, she had brushed it off, always saying, maybe in a few years. Then a few years turned into more years. And now I wasn't sure if she had ever really wanted it at all. I finished my coffee and headed back. By the time I reached the penthouse, Lauren was awake, standing in the kitchen in nothing but one of her silk robes, sipping a green smoothie like she hadn't spent last night dismissing everything I said. She glanced at me as I walked in, her gaze flicking to my empty hands. "No coffee for me?" she asked, half joking, half expecting. I tossed my keys onto the counter. "Didn't think you'd want something from a place that doesn't serve oat milk lattes." She rolled her eyes, setting her smoothie down. "You're in a mood." I let out a humorless laugh, rubbing the back of my neck. "Yeah, maybe I am." She sighed, like she was already tired of this conversation. "Jack, if this is about last night." "It is," I cut in. "And it's about every night before that, and every morning like this one where we pretend everything's fine." She pressed her lips together, exhaling through her nose. "We're just going through a rough patch." I shook my head. "That's not what this is." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "So what? You want to throw in the towel? Just like that?" "I want to know if you're even willing to try," I said, my voice low, controlled. "Because I don't think you are." She looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "I don't know what you want from me, Jack." "I want my wife back," I admitted, just like I had last night. "I want us back. But I can't be the only one who wants that." She was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're being so dramatic." That was it. That was the moment I felt something inside me snap. I stepped closer, resting my hands on the counter, forcing her to look at me. "Dramatic," I repeated, my voice sharp. "Lauren, we don't talk. We don't touch. We don't even exist in the same world anymore. You act like I'm just some guy who pays for all of this. Like I'm not even worth a second of your attention." She rolled her eyes, but I didn't let her turn away this time. "Look at me," I said, my voice firm. "Really look at me." She hesitated, then met my gaze. For the first time in a long time, I saw something break through the indifference. A flicker of something real, something raw. And then, just as quickly, she shut it down. She pushed away from the counter, grabbing her smoothie, turning her back to me. "I don't want to do this right now." Of course she didn't. I stared at her for a long moment before letting out a slow breath, nodding to myself. "All right," I murmured. "I get it now." She turned, frowning slightly. "Get what?" I picked up my keys, slipping them into my pocket. "That you made your choice a long time ago." She blinked, confused, but I didn't give her the chance to respond. I grabbed my briefcase and walked out the door, leaving her standing there, still clutching that stupid smoothie, still pretending she didn't understand. But I knew she did. She knew exactly what I meant. And for the first time since this all started, I wasn't sure if I cared anymore. I didn't come straight home that night. I stayed late at the office, even though there wasn't much left to do. I watched the city lights flicker outside my window, my hands resting on my desk, my mind hollow. People came and went, saying good night, telling me not to work too hard. I nodded, forcing a polite smile, but the truth was, I wasn't working at all. I was just avoiding going back to a place that didn't feel like home anymore. By the time I finally stepped into the penthouse, it was past 11. I half expected Lauren to be asleep, but she wasn't. She was sitting on the couch, legs curled under her, scrolling through her phone. The same position, the same glow of the screen lighting up her face, the same indifference. She didn't look up when I walked in. I dropped my briefcase by the door, shrugged off my coat, and just stood there for a second, waiting, hoping she'd say something. She didn't. "Long day?" I asked, my voice tired. She hummed in response, a vague, uninterested noise that barely registered. I nodded to myself. "Right?" I headed toward the bedroom, loosening my tie, feeling the weight of it all settle into my bones. I could feel her presence in the next room, but it might as well have been miles away. I went through the motions, showered, changed into something more comfortable, checked my emails one last time. I was stalling, not because I wanted to talk, but because I was finally realizing something I hadn't let myself acknowledge until now. I didn't care anymore. Not the way I used to. I had spent months, maybe even years, trying to hold on to something that was already gone. I had fought for this marriage, for Lauren, for us. But there was nothing left to fight for. She had stopped choosing me a long time ago, and I had been too stubborn, too hopeful, too blind to see it. Until now, when I finally stepped back into the living room, she was still in the same position, still scrolling. Cleared my throat. Lauren, she sighed, setting her phone down like I was an inconvenience. What? I stared at her for a long moment, taking in the way she barely looked at me, the way she had already dismissed me before I even spoke. And that was it. That was the final nail in the coffin. I'm done. She blinked, her brows pulling together. What? I exhaled, shaking my head. I'm done, Lauren. She laughed, like it was a joke, like she hadn't heard me right. What are you even talking about? I gestured around the room, at the penthouse, at the empty space between us. This marriage. She sat up straighter, her expression shifting. Jack, you're being ridiculous. No, I said, my voice firm. I'm being honest. Probably for the first time in a long time. She stared at me, her lips slightly parted, searching my face like she was trying to figure out if I was serious. You don't mean that, she said finally, her voice quieter now. I do. She shook her head, her fingers curling around the edge of her phone, like she needed something to hold on to. So what, you're just giving up? I let out a breathless laugh. I'm not giving up. I'm just accepting the truth. Lauren was silent for a long time. And then, just like that, she rolled her eyes and leaned back against the couch. Fine, she said, picking up her phone again. Do whatever you want. That was all I needed to hear. I turned and walked to the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag, and started packing. Not everything, just enough. Enough to make it clear that this wasn't an empty threat, that I was really leaving. When I came back out, she was still on the couch, still scrolling. She didn't even look up. I stood there for a moment, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, waiting to see if she'd say anything, if she'd ask me to stay, if she'd even acknowledge that I was walking out the door. She didn't. I nodded to myself, gripping the strap of my bag. Take care, Lauren. And then I left. The elevator ride down was quiet. The lobby was quiet. The streets were quiet. Everything was quiet. But for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel heavy. Felt like freedom. I didn't know exactly where I was going, or what my life would look like after this. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done being invisible in my own life.